Here we are.
Thank you.
You know, Thurston, I was really struck by your book when I read it. You know, you yourself have mentioned this in you know, some of the conversations you've had about the book, that it's not your standard kind of rock bio. You know, you really set out, I think, on a more ambitious path to both describe your own development and describe an entire scene. And there's really sort of much more of a kind of communal feel than you often get, you know, from such books. And I wonder, you know, if you could talk a little bit about your desire to take that approach, and if it just evolved, or if you set out consciously to do it, or some combination of the above.
I certainly wanted to write about community. That was always very important to me at a very young age, when I decided to devote myself to the vocation of being an artist in the discipline of music. It's what I had seen happening here in New York City as a teenager, and coming here and seeing what I saw as a community. And before I even became an eyewitness to it, it was always about gleaning it from the literature of music, the rock magazines, whether it be Rolling Stone or the more localized magazines of New York. Hit Parader was a magazine that came out of
Sure.
the area, but specifically a magazine like Rock Scene magazine, which Lisa and Richard Robinson were editing, and they were very focused on what was happening downtown in New York, and from the early '70s onwards.
Circus.
And it always seemed to me like there was this micro community of activity that was like really curious, really interesting, really intriguing, and unlike anything I that was in my reality in rural Connecticut, you know, which was just high school life. And even the music that was shared in high school was, I didn't have any issue with it. I mean, I was okay with Bachman Turner Overdrive and
taking care of business.
I mean, you know, Deep Purple, you know, like kids coming to school with a copy of Deep Purple's Machine Head under their arm, and that was like this kind of very serious boy kind of totem, you know. And then the girls would have Carole King's Tapestry under their arm, and you know, and that was the world that existed. But as soon as I saw images of what was happening in the downtown New York scene early on, certainly with like the New York Dolls, who were very kind of the kingpins of this kind of new music in New York, I was really attracted to that. I don't know why I was attracted to it outside of the more standard music that was available on radio, whether it was Bachman Turner Overdrive or anything. But it seemed really subversive to me, and I don't know why I was enchanted by these subversive signals.
You know, one thing that occurs to me is it seems to me like you were kind of prepared for it in a funny way by your parents, or the way that you grew up. You know, I loved, you know, you described going over to your friends' houses, and like in your house, you know, there were musical instruments, and there were, you know, books around, and albums, and all of these things, you know, the kind of artifacts of culture. And you said, you know, often I just went to my friend's house, and, you know, there were knickknacks and bric-a-brac, right, as you put it. And, you know, I think that like that kind of cultural grounding kind of set you up to really appreciate, because you got bit immediately, man. Like when you came to New York, it was, this is it.
You're probably right. Yeah, my father, he had he existed in his man cave, which was a library of music texts and philosophy books, and he was always playing the piano, and he was going off to university and teaching music and art appreciation, and you know, he's a very sort of you know, just academic gentleman, you know, in our household. He died when I was in my late teens, and I just took it for granted that that's what parents were like. My mother was a homemaker, and she was, you know, but she was also an intellectual in her own right. But we were sort of a typical family. It was a very safe family. Like there wasn't any psychological or physical abuse in my family. And it was like 3 kids and two parents and a dog and a cat and the whole deal in a backyard in a small town in Connecticut. We had there was definitely this more marginalized culture in our house of like music and literature and art. There was like Picasso prints on the wall, and I really figured that's what every household was like until I actually started visiting other households,
Right.
and seeing that wasn't the case. And I was like, well, where's all the books and where's all the music and why is the TV on all the time? And it's just so. You might be right about that. Maybe that sort of led me into wanting to sort of find things that were maybe had more profundity to it. But I don't know. I mean, I didn't see it as it being anything strange, really, or better or worse. I mean, I wasn't really judgmental about it and thinking it was anything that had any kind of superior consequence, or I feel like, and it's not like my siblings kind of went that route. They have more sort of conservative lifestyles, and they're both older than I have, and so they kind of progressed into more sort of conservative domestic lifestyles, which they were okay with. But that was certainly not something I was interested in at all. I was just interested in getting on the train, coming to New York, and finding out where these things were happening, where Patti Smith Group was playing, and that's pretty much it.
There's a kind of fervor to it, to those sections, that is really compelling. Can you talk a little bit about, just some of the things you saw initially that just lit you up and that made it so that you were constantly desiring to come back and constantly desiring to check out new things and, eventually, getting yourself to the point of moving here?
I couldn't figure out how to do it. In those days, in the 70s, you could get your driver's license at like 16 or something like that, if I remember correctly. And
maybe I grew up in Manhattan, so I never learned how to drive.
Yeah, and I started driving. I mean, I turned 20 in 1978. So a couple of years before that, I was I was trying to figure out how to get here, and I was closer to like New Haven, Connecticut, and so I started going there because I knew there was a record store there. It was a record store called Cutler's, and I sort of knew about that because I had read an interview with Lenny Kaye where he was talking about record stores that he liked, and one of them was Cutler's in New Haven. So I went to Cutler's in New Haven because Lenny Kaye knew what he was talking about. And Lenny Kaye already sort of was such a informative voice in the early 70s. He was doing rock writing. He seems like somebody who had his finger on the pulse of like what was like really worth listening to. He curated Nuggets in the early 70s, which was like the first overview of just these kind of more arcane garage rock sides that kind of somewhat predicted punk rock. And so I gave Lenny Kaye a lot of attention. And then when he said there was this record store in New Haven called Cutler's, I went there and I started bugging the proprietor of the record store. I was like, have you heard of this band called Blondie? I heard they have an album coming out. And he was like, how do you know about that? And I said, well, Lenny Kaye wrote about them. And he said, how do you know about Lenny Kaye? And I was just like, well, one thing led to the other. So I started going to this place regularly. And then to get to New York was a little more challenging because it just seemed like this really sort of monolithic kind of chaotic city that was just out of reach. There was nobody in my high school who had any interest in any of the stuff that I was finding in the far reaches of these magazines, And but there was one kid who I would see around, and he was very effeminate, and he would walk down the hallways of the high school, and he had a scarf on, and he reeked of cologne, and he was really swishy and really fascinating to me. And I knew that he was into like David Bowie, because I could overhear him talking about David Bowie, and he was talking about like this movie Barbarella that really kind of was like, and so I was like, I have to know who this kid is, and and eventually he approached me because he saw me walking around with some of these magazines, and we were kind of eyeing each other. And in early '70s high school life in rural Connecticut, to present yourself as queer in high school, it was asking for trouble. It was a danger zone. And he didn't seem to care, but he still got the brunt of abuse. So I would see him get pushed up against the lockers. I would see him get thrown to the ground and called names. And I was just, I was like, how can he withstand this? But he would just get up and brush himself off and haughtily walk away with his head in the air. And I very much admired him. And we were just teenagers, and he was a year younger than me. And at one point in the high school parking lot, he came running over to me. He said, Patti Smith is playing in Westport, Connecticut tonight at the Westport County Playhouse. I was like, well, do you want to go? And he was like, yeah, but how are we going to get there? And neither of us had a car or anything like that. I said, well, let me go ask so-and-so who has a car. It was just some kind of jockey kid, and I went over and said, "Can you drive us to Westport, Connecticut?" and I think there was an exchange. It was like, "We have marijuana" or something like that. And so there,
no one rides for free. Yeah,
he was like, "Okay, get in," and he like put the pedal to the metal, and we kind of like we just roared into Westport, Connecticut through these winding roads, past like these Connecticut ponds, and we made it to Westport, and that was one of the most incredible things I had ever seen, because I'd been to a few concerts. I saw like Peter Frampton,
sure,
and Jay Giles Band, and I saw Zappa, but none of it was transcendent. I mean, it's just like it was a concert in a Coliseum in New Haven Coliseum, and you're up in the nosebleed seats and going like, okay, I'm here. And it's like, and nothing ever really paid off. I even saw like David Bowie on his Thin White Tube tour, which I thought was the coolest thing I saw, because he showed Un Chien Andalou at the beginning of the concert.
Yes, I remember
that. So the film with the sliced eyeball, of course, everybody there was like, ooh, and I was just like, that's curious. I wonder where he got that film from. But I thought it was such an audacious thing. So that was good, but nothing made me leave the arena feeling like my life was changed. But seeing this gig at Westport County Playhouse we got there and we found our seats. I mean, there was tickets at the door. There were $8, and I was like, oh my God! And we got in there and we sat in some benches in there. And they came out, and it was right before Horses was released, and I had already sent away for her 7-inch of Hey Joe with Piss Factory on it, and because I saw it advertised. And to me, I just really wanted to hear what a rock writer, a music writer sounded like making a record, because that's how it was presented. Because I had I'd seen her byline through the years. It was all lowercase, as much of her writing was, and it was always this kind of critical exclamation. It was far different than most of the male rock writers, where it was like this kind of snarky analysis. This was always this kind of more celebratory kind of prose about whatever she was writing about, whether it was Todd Rundgren or the Beach Boys, And so I was really curious about who she was, and then I certainly seeing some pictures along with her poetry in Cream magazine, which was like also somewhat alluring, and. So the fact that she had done a 7-inch, and was it like in '75 or something like that?
Yeah.
And sending away for that, because I was just like, what does this writer sound like on making a record? I thought that was audacious, like breaking this boundary of sorts. And of course, that record was amazing sounding. Her version of Hey Joe with the recitation at the beginning about Patty Hearst, and then the flip side was even more sort of startling, which was this just speed bop poem, and then you recognize Tom Verlaine's name because you had sort of seen that name in the magazines too, and there was just playing this scratchy guitar line, and television hadn't even released a record yet. I think Little Johnny Jewel came shortly thereafter. So all of these things were really significant, but going to see this gig was was just in the flesh happening. And yeah, they came out and she was like wearing a leather jacket and chewing gum and just looking motorcycle badass, and and then taking the leather jacket off and throwing it on the drum riser, and they just blast into "We're Gonna Have a Real Good Time Together" by the Velvet Underground.
Sure.
Which I was just like, I bet nobody here knows what this song is. I know what this song is. And it was like, so it was just amazing because it was like this, it was really primal garage rock. And then they went through their repertoire at the time, and Patty talked to the audience without kowtowing, and like not like, how you doing out there, blah, 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 which what you usually would hear. And she was saying kind of smart, funny stuff. She said something, if I remember correctly, like, yeah, AM, FM radio, it's sort of like the Democrats and the Republicans on the same thing. And I was just like, wow, that's an interesting. And then, yeah, at some point, she went over to Lenny Kaye and started kissing him during some kind of guitar breakout, and then they both blew like white gardenia flowers out of their mouths. I was like, oh, that's a good move. Yeah, it was very cool. But that was definitely something where I got up and I was like, okay, that's what I want to do. I want to be part of whatever that is. I want to be in that community wherever they're coming from, and I knew where it was. And eventually, we decided to drive into New York without knowing anything of what was playing or whatever. And we got in a car. This friend Harold, his name was Harold, the kid I met in school, and we just drove into New York looking for Park Avenue because we heard that's where Max's Kansas City was. And as you know, Park Avenue is
pretty long, yeah.
Pretty long. And so we eventually found it, and we parked illegally somewhere, and we got inside of Max's, and we sat there at the bar, and it was like 6 p.m. We were like, well, what's going on? There's nothing going on here. It was just businessmen drinking cocktails and such. And then I noticed people started coming into another door. And I asked the bartender, I said, where's the music? Is that the back room that I've heard about? And he's like, no, there's no back room anymore. It's like over. The music's upstairs, by the way. And I was like, oh, we were just kids. And
coin a phrase.
And so we got in line on the stairwell, and we went up, and it just happened to be Suicide, the band Suicide. And I saw the poster. It said Suicide, Fuse, a band called Fuse from Brooklyn, and the Cramps from Ohio. It was a second Cramps gig in New York.
Wow.
They had come once before, and this was their second gig. And so for me, I was like, okay, the Fuse band, that sounds cool. Cramps sounds just weird. And Suicide, that must be like a hard rock band, like a Suicide. And we were just, we were ill prepared for that evening. So, and the Cramps were great. They came out, and Lux Interior, like he just had the microphone up to his waist, and so he had to sort of crouch down and sing like that. And I was like, well, that's cool. And then Miriam Linna, the drummer, which had her drumsticks in a leopard skin pocketbook that she would take out and like play, and then she'd put them back in after the set. And she was the last one off stage, and somebody said encore, and she just sort of like sneered, put her cat glasses on, sneered, and walked off. It was not Frampton, and Suicide were ferocious. I mean, it was Alan Vega and Martin Rove, high volume, just pummeling. And Max's is about the size of this room. It maybe not even as big, in a way. It was just sort of like banquet tables like that. It's a very sort of shallow room and a very shallow stage. It's a tiny place, and they just like came out and just did this like. And Alan was just like walking across the tables, like knocking people's drinks off and wrapping his microphone cord around people's necks and screaming at high reverb screech, in your face. And people started upending the tables to protect themselves. So yeah, we drove home in silence that night.
Wow.
And we were just like, and it was one of those things. It was like, we have to go back. We have to go back. And so we just started coming back. Anytime I would read about something interesting, I would say, oh, we have to go see this. Like the Dead Boys, when they first came out from Cleveland, it's like, well, this is the band where the singer gave Iggy Pop the peanut butter at the Cincinnati Rock Festival. And I was like, oh, we got to see that. And that turned out to be, fantastic. Or even like a film like Amos Poe, one of his films like The Foreigner that he made that Debbie Harry's in. It's like this Super 8 film that it was his take on Godard. And there was a little ad in the Village Voice for The Foreigner by Amos Poe, and it just sort of had this this film critic comment on the top in quotes that said, "Depressing, ... And I was like, oh, we gotta go see that.
Yeah.
We gotta go.
It sounds like the immediacy of the experience, the immediacy of the music was really a part of what it was that you were feeling, like in a way that like those arena shows that you were describing, did not really provide. I was saying earlier by way of introducing you, talking about, growing up in Lower Manhattan. Actually, I grew up in the West Village, and even I left to go to graduate school in the mid '70s, but was always coming back, and familiar with the world that you were describing and the streets that you were describing. Can you talk about what that experience of New York was like for you at that time?
Well, writing this book, I really wanted to just really write about that. I mean, writing this book, I just really wanted to write. It was all about wanting to do like a long form text, right?
Well, it's one point that you make that is really, people don't even think about it anymore. And they've also stopped crediting people, which is sort of interesting. But, you wrote this book yourself. Like you weren't using, some sort of like, ghostwriter or anything else that people, So, I mean, that is actually something that also makes it like very distinctive. And, your voice is so strong within it. And, that sense of the, your emotional connection to these experiences that you're describing is very strong, I think for that reason. But anyway, please continue.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, I really just wanted to write, and I've always written lyrics, but I've always been involved with writing as a discipline. So I've been editing. I've edited a poetry journal for a number of years. And very engaged with the poetry community of downtown New York around St. Mark's Poetry Project, with the director Ann Waldman, and eventually with the school that she and Allen Ginsberg had founded under the auspices of the Buddhist Trungpa Rinpoche, which was a school in Boulder, Colorado, called Naropa Institute, which became an accredited university, and it became Naropa University. And
you've taught there.
Yeah, and so in 1974, Ann Waldman and Allen Ginsberg were asked by Rinpoche to do a summer writing workshop of teaching poetry, poetics, writing, and to be a bit of a school of peace. Where peace was like on the curriculum, which was pretty radical if you think about that. And they did, and it's still today is like one of the great summer writing workshops I think that is in the world. That the teachers that have taught there has been from Kathy Acker to William Burroughs to to Ishmael Reed. It's just like it's incredible. Timothy Leary, and I got really. Involved with that school through Anne when she found out that I was really involved with publishing poetry through the years, and I became also a great archivist of post-war self-produced poetry, stapled Xerox Mimeos, poetry coming from different scenes around the USA primarily, and to some degree Canada and some European and some English stuff, but I really got involved with that. Trying to archive that world of publications because it was disappearing, so when I would go on tour, I would like look for these documents, because they were being tossed from English departments at universities, and they would end up in the back of bookstores with like the cat sleeping on top of these amazing like poetry journals. where all of this work by Ted Berrigan and Alice Notley and Bernadette Mayer all existed. And I became really fascinated by that. I really equated it with like what I liked about the independent means of punk rock music and small labels and artist-run labels and these kind of communicating with each other. And so that just, to me, that life of the writer was really special. I always sort of saw myself going towards that after getting off the road, so to speak, of being a musician. And I'm in my mid-60s now, and that's kind of where I'm at. And so I really wanted to sit down and write a long-form book. And I was going to write something meta about music. I was going to write a book that was more about music essaying and focusing on what I thought were these significant documents that would lead a young person into devoting themselves to the vocation of being a musician. So the first time coming across Seventh Heaven, which is Patti Smith's first, at least first high-profile book in some sense. She had a couple other publications before then, but and certainly certain recordings, the first television 7-inch. All of these things that were kind of like these sort of new documents that were happening in the mid-'70s. I kind of wanted to write about the trajectory of those, of going into the '80s, and how they were being read and shared by, like, I would meet people from Melbourne, Australia. It was like, I felt like I was the only person who knew about this, and then you kind of meet each other through this kind of shared energy from these things. I kind of wanted to write about those things and what they meant into our culture, to our subculture. And I got a book agent. It was the same book agent who did like the Beastie Boys book.
Sure.
Because we have a bit of a connection there through the same management. And so I was like, okay, that was a, I really wanted a book that was with a major publishing house.
Sure.
Because I wanted it to get out there.
Get out there,
really.
yeah.
And I was like,
exactly.
I didn't want to be too political about it, like in the recording business, where he's like, you don't want to be with a corporate record label because they have a history of creating bluesmen contracts and ripping off artists. It's like, well, that's not really the same. That doesn't really correlate with like the book industry, although they probably have their own sort of demonic kind of culture.
Well, also though, I mean, to just interject here for a second, even when Sonic Youth signed with Geffen. You talk a bit about, you get it. You get what the criticism is about and, why you weren't supposed to do it. But you said like, well, maybe now I don't have to have a day job, and maybe now I can have health insurance, and maybe now,
that was all part of it.
Yeah. It was a reality.
That was a weird trade-off because, and I understand it, but I think it psychologically, it kind of diffuses you culturally. And, I felt the same kind of prejudice when I would see bands that I really admired for their stature of DIY and their independence, and then when they would go to a corporate record label which would facilitate them having a higher profile.
Yeah, when you said like, how is Husker Du on Warner Brothers?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
How is that? Yeah.
So when Husker Du signed to Warner Brothers, it was pretty jarring in a way. Because they did their own records, they were on SST, and then they were like one of the first bands of our ilk to do that. The only other band that had really signed off to a major label and had a success early on was REM, but REM had done that so early on, in a way. They were a bit of an anomaly in that whole situation. But coming later into the 80s, and so our contemporary bands, like a contemporary band like Husker Du, and to some degree the Replacements, signing to major labels. Yeah, it was like there was something very sort of politically polarizing about it. And it was like the music they were making wasn't that much different than you would expect on any other label, but it was on a major label, and somehow it just sort of it sort of lost some of its personality in some ways. sort of being on a major label. And
Did you feel that about Sonic Youth?
I felt that way with Sonic Youth.
You did?
Yeah, and we kind of purposefully, our first record we did with Geffen, I purposely used Raymond Pettibone to do the artwork, because Raymond Pettibone was so associated with the more sort of radical aspects of the underground. His record covers for Black Flag and Minutemen, and we had done records with SST, and we were connected with him and friendly with him, and we were certainly into his work. And how would his work look on a major label was like a question, as opposed to even like Sonic Youth being on a major label. How's that going to work? And so it was a little bit of a safety in numbers thing. Like, let's have Raymond to do the cover. I basically just tore a page out of one of Raymond Pettibone's stapled mimeos that he made of his artwork, which he would sell for a couple of dollars at record stores. These have become really rarefied art books these days. You can't find them for less than $2,000 on eBay. But they were like, you would find them around, and they were like $1 or $2, and I used to just collect them or get them from him, and I just found a couple of images in one or two of those books, and I tore them out, and I just Scotch taped them to like a blank white 12-inch sleeve. If you look at the cover, you can see like my hair underneath the Scotch tape. And I thought that was like, when I was working with the art director at Geffen, he was like, we should clean this up. I was like, no, leave it like that. It's how I do fanzines and stuff like that. It's like, I think it should look like a fanzine. He was like, what's a fanzine? I was like, well, it's not a magazine, it's a fanzine. So that was the aesthetic. And then we did this, the inner sleeve was like a photo session we did with Michael Levine, who was a photographer living on the Bowery across from CBGB's, who came out of the whole Seattle scene around Nirvana and everybody. And so we did this really sort of kind of where we were sort of overly dressing up but getting it wrong kind of thing, and being really glammy with feather boas. And we thought we would put that inside just to sort of juxtapose with
playing with the idea.
Yeah. I don't think anybody really read into it at all or got it really. I don't know. But
oh, thank you.
The building is surrounded by the New York police. So everybody just
really. So where were we? We just
we went towards this whole thing of selling out to a major.
Oh yeah.
Or being on a major publisher with this book, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, and I the thing is, I got a book deal saying, my agent saying, I get you a book deal, but it's going to be a memoir, it's a Sonic Youth memoir, and blah blah. I said, that's fine. I mean, it was a device for me to write. I mean, I would have written about anything. I kind of wanted to write just about music essaying and just more of a cultural critique book. But I could write about.
Well, you wrote about Sonic Youth in your own way.
I could be the cipher and sort of do it that way. And I felt a little uneasy about that because I'm kind of private in a lot. Well, my private life I like to keep private, but I sort of was a little bit of I had to be kind of deft with it, and I just spent the pandemic year with like a sheet over my head, just writing it, and just doing intense research as much as I could during that year because the libraries were closed. Making sure that it was chronologically correct, and I had like the right dates and everything. And I had all the dates in there, and then I took them out because it gets a little anal retentive when you see like on January 22nd, 1985 at 8 p.m. we went on stage. I was like, why don't we just take that out and go like, early in the year of '85 we played this gig. I mean, so to me it was like making these kind of decisions, these editorial decisions, and working with a very good editor. At Doubleday at that point, this gentleman Yaniv Sara, and we, which was really for me was just great joy. I mean, everything about writing and creating a book to me is just like it's wonderful. And to spend a year editing, I loved it. I mean, I just loved like going back and forth and just Xing out like page after page because I delivered an 800-page manuscript. And the
Wow.
book is already hefty at like three something.
It's near 500 pages.
About
Yeah.
500 pages.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a great read, but it's, you know.
It's long, I know.
Yeah, you're not gonna.
To me, it's so thinned out that I can't think of it as long because there was so much more in there.
Right.
You know, but I guess it is. Even the guy from Rush, what's his name, Geddy Lee?
Yeah.
He says the same thing. I wrote 800 pages, and they took it all away. It's like, you know, I mean, his band has been around since, you know, 78 or something like that, right? Rush? Earlier? I don't know. You know, Rush were kind of like a Dalsy glam band at first, you know, in Canada, before they kind of went more prog and, let's not talk about Rush.
It was so funny, you know, I was on the nominating committee for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for many years, and every year until they got in, I mean, we'd get like thousands of letters from Rush fans. I mean, they were always like, a very determined group. I wonder, you know, obviously the world has changed, you know, New York has changed, the scene has changed, whatever the underground is at this point. You know, there are a lot of opportunities to get music out there. It's a very different time. You know, people, you know, I get, you know, because I grew up in the 60s and have interviewed a lot of, you know, people from that era who are, you know, important. You know, people often ask me, well, younger people ask me, you know, like, well, gee, you know, what's going on now that's like that? You know, what, you know, what's available? I feel like it's all happened already. It's all gone. Like, what do you say when people say that to you?
I think it's always new and I think it's always concurrent in its newness. Let's put it that way. I don't ever think it's any better or worse at any different time period. I think what's going on musically now, I've continually fascinated by like new artists and new music that I hear. It's just through different channels. I don't think there's much of a so-called band scene or even like a record scene or whatever. There's an interesting documentary that you can find online on the band The Melvins. You know, Buzz and the Melvins, and you know the Melvins are really they're extremely significant band in a lot of what has happened since, you know, '88 onwards. Specifically with a band like Nirvana, who really sort of, you know, were born out of like, you know, the Melvins as instigators and inspiration, and you know, it was interesting hearing Buzz talk about it, because he goes, you know, when I make records now, I don't really make records for people to listen to. He goes, it's like we're not going back. People want to listen to music. They're going to listen to music, and they're going to listen to it anytime they want to, and they're going to listen to it at whatever price point they suggest for themselves, which is usually free. So it's like that's where the music. I don't fool myself into thinking any music I make, whether it's live or recordings, that I'm able to sort of sell it as something that you won't be able to hear exclusively. You can hear it. You will hear it, no matter what, because it's going to be made available to you free. That's all there is to it. That's been figured out. That's not turning back. So when I make records as objects, as collectible objects for those people who collect toys or whatever. I make a record that has really cool stuff in it. 3D glasses. My wife does the artwork. It's a gatefold sleeve. It's splatter vinyl. It's 300 copies. It's boutique. It's a physical object. It's tangible. You can touch it and get the vibrational that you won't be able to get from a download. Thank you. And that's what it's like. That's what I make records for. You know, it's like, you know, maybe somebody plays them, but I don't think nobody's really playing them really. Maybe some of the geeks like you and me are, but it's like, yeah, for the most part, that's not how people are listening to music. And so that's fine. So that's the reality. That said, I hear and see so much incredible music making happening, whether it's just like straightforward, contemporary, traditional aspect music, or if it's really just hardcore experimental stuff, like noise music or drone music, music that is being informed by different arcane world musics happening all the time through platforms, specifically a platform like Bandcamp, which is always, issuing. It's like a great marketplace for anybody who wants to sort of disseminate their music, either digitally or through selling a record or a cassette or a CD or what have you. And that's a fantastic place, and I don't really know too much about the makeup of it, but I do like the fact that every once in a while they have what's called Bandcamp Friday, where the artists get the entire revenue of their sales without giving the small percentage that Bandcamp makes to it. So yeah, I mean that's what that is. And then there's of course all the streaming services where you can just access music at any given time, which I personally don't use. I do utilize Bandcamp mostly because I like buying certain records and cassettes off. I never really buy digital music. I don't feel like I have enough time to actually listen to music in that respect. And maybe I feel like maybe I've decoded it so much that I don't really feel like I need to hear it that way. And I actually really sort of like the vibratory quality of a tangible object. I like, you can't roll a joint on a download.
Talking about all this, you recently, within the last couple of months, released a very beautiful album, with an extraordinarily beautiful name, Flow, Critical Lucidity. And, I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit before we start exploring some of the questions from our audience.
Oh, well, thank you. Flow, Critical Lucidity is a line from a song called Sans Limite, No Limits. It's one of the songs on the record. The last 4 or 5 records I've made while living in London. I've lived there for about 12 years now. And I work very closely in tandem with my wife Eva, and she's a writer, and she writes a lot of the lyrics. She wrote the lyrics to that song. She wrote the lyrics to most of the songs on the record. And that line comes from that song, Flow. And it's about lucid dreaming. It's about this idea of being alert to your
sort of what's going on inside you, it seems to me.
Exactly. And it also sounded to me, I actually chose that title from a lot of the lyrics that were on the record. I was pulling out different possibilities, and I liked that one because it sounded like a title of a Fall album.
Sure.
Slow, critical, like a Marquis Smith kind of phrase, and so it was a bit of a working title. I was like, there's no way we could use that as a title. It's a little clunky, possibly. I don't know. I never thought it was that clunky. I thought it was pretty flowing, and it stuck. And so,
it seemed to me like the kind of thing. It made since I, came upon it obviously and listen. I mean, the music is something. Obviously, the album has that quality that I feel like where it almost is like one long song to me for some reason. I'm sure, we could parse it forever, the 7 or 8 tracks that are on it. But that line in particular is something I think about in my own writing, like a wish for myself, like flow, critical lucidity, let it come, let it, let the ideas come forth,
Yeah, I mean the record was written in mostly in a artist residence in Switzerland that I've used before, and you're just in like a little room, like it might as well be like a little hotel room, but it just so happens like when you open the door to this room, there's like Lake Geneva in the Alps. And I was like, oh, and so there was a lot of contemplation of just sort of nature and earth and just sort of like. Feeling that and wanting to sort of talk about that to some degree with the lyrically in the record.
Yeah, the importance of the natural world is something that runs through it. I mean, not in like you're writing an op-ed piece, but like references to nature and, kind of in its meaning and its feeling, seem to be occupying these songs quite a bit.
Yeah, to some degree, especially through coming out of the pandemic year as well, and just sort of, especially that year, experiencing this, this kind of, there was somewhat of a renewal happening within the natural world, because we were sort of detoxifying it for a second, and you saw sort of immediate responses from the natural world. And it's like things started becoming alive, and waters started clearing up, and skies started looking blue again, and I started getting interested in like what was happening before the industrial age, like in the world versus like it was it was a world of such richer hues that we will never know in our lifetime. We never knew because it was just we don't live in that era. But it really made me kind of wonder, and thinking about like when you're looking at impressionist paintings, etc. It's like, why are they so vibrant? It's like, because they didn't have such a toxified universe that they were painting their reality at that time. And it's just like it's interesting, and it's also interesting thinking about our children's future as well. My daughter lives here in New York, and she's 30 years old, and I think about her after I'm gone. Like what the environment will be, how she can accommodate it. Because it seems to be consistently ignored on as far as us being caretakers of it and having any power over trying to sort of find some kind of subsidy for it. So that does sort of run through the record. I mean, to some degree. I don't know. I find like I find more pleasure in like abstraction sometimes when I'm writing these things. And people always talk about themes to records. And certainly with Sonic Youth, after a record would come out, there would be some kind of theme attached to it. And I was like, well, that certainly wasn't there that wasn't the intention when we were making the record. We were just writing songs and we were trying to come up with lyrics together and blah, blah, blah. And then it would create like a bit of there would be some thematic kind of definition to the record. And it was really always a bit of a mystical, magical thing. And I always liked that. I was like, oh, that was always there. But
that was what was happening.
And I find that in writing as well. It's like, well, how do you even begin to write? And I was like, the way to begin to write is just to start writing and see what happens, and you'll find that it actually sort of opens up and it starts defining itself, and narratives will become more apparent to you. If you just start doing it, like just sort of put words
absolutely
on the page. And
the words of a writing teacher, absolutely.
So I find that with music as well. It's just like. Sometimes I have a little bit of a fear of creative impulse. It's like, oh my God, because it's so powerful.
Like once you commit to it, like you're.
Yeah, a little bit. But I figure like if just picking up a guitar, which I'm not like a real guitar player, but I always get like talked about like my guitar playing. But it's like I'm so not a traditional technique guitar player, and so when I pick up a guitar, I know that I'm not going to be referencing too much of what's in traditional music, but it's always something that's prepared differently, or is tuned to an alternate tuning or whatever. And I figure like as soon as I just start playing, it's just like I allow ideas to sort of introduce themselves.
Yeah, they emerge.
And I think that's the same thing in the discipline of writing as well, as as a writer, So,
well, let's take some questions from the audience. One very specific: are you still in touch with Harold?
Well, Harold passed away in some point in the '80s, and we were friends. We remained friends. I moved to New York, and he would come visit me, and he would stay with me sometimes. And he kind of didn't really like the fact that I started having new friends, in New York. And he thought they were kind of too arty. And he was like really into just like straight ahead kind of rock and roll, the punk scene of Ramones and Johnny Thunder and the Heartbreakers and Wayne County, and then when I started getting involved with like Glenn Branco and Reese Chatham and Lydia Lunch and all that, and he was just like, those people are so weird and blah blah blah, and like, he didn't like that music so much, Mars and DNA and all these things, and I was totally into it. And so we kind of started not seeing eye to eye on the things that we always felt like we did see eye to eye on. And then he came out and he had a boyfriend and he was still living in Connecticut, and he would come see me once in a while. And when Sonic Youth started playing gigs early on, he was around. At some point, I went to Connecticut with the band, and we were going on tour, and we had Steve Shelley's van that we kind of usurped from him, and he came out from the Midwest with a van, and we okay, we can go on tour. And so we were in a van, and we stopped at my mother's house, and we went over to Harold and his boyfriend's house, me and Lee and Kim and Bob Burt, and we were all hanging out and just sort of like, just drinking and smoking a little bit and stuff like that. And I guess we were being typical sort of downtown art rock people, kind of kvetching and being wise asses, and just like thinking we were being like young and smarty pants, and something bothered him about that. And the next morning we went out to the van, and the all the records I had given him, which basically were 2 Sonic Youth records. It was the first one in Confusion is Sex. I think Kill Your Idols 12-inch as well, which I assigned to Harold, and he put them out on the windshield of the van. He said, why don't you here's your records back, give them to your snotty friends.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and I was just like, wow, what's going on here? And it was just one of those things. And then I didn't really keep in contact with him, and he moved down to North Carolina, and he was there, and I had heard from him when I was on tour with Neil Young. Sonic Youth was playing in some arena in North Carolina, and somebody came up to me and said, there's a Harold Paris who wants to say hi and come in. I was like, oh, let him in. But I never saw him, because it was an arena somewhere, and I was just like, wherever he was, I wasn't, or whatever. I mean, we never.
Sure.
And then we got on the bus and we shot out and we were gone. And so I was like, I didn't see him. So I never saw him again until one night. I woke up in the middle of the night and he was standing in the room, and I saw his visage, and he was just like kind of looking at me, and I was like, wow, it's Harold. And then I kind of faded back into sleep in a way, because it was really strange. And the next day I got an email from somebody saying, Harold passed away yesterday.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I did. I mean, I will always remember seeing him in that respect. And I'm not like a,
Yeah, woo-woo kind of guy.
I'm not woo-woo. And so, but I was that night. And so, yeah, Harold was really special to me. And I write about him very, as much as I can in this book. I thought that relationship was really important to me. And in some ways, I got a lot of feedback from a lot of young people who really were touched by that aspect. This relationship between me and this young guy, and he was finding his identity. As we were growing up in a place that was very unaccepting, and in some ways, coming to New York and discovering the punk rock scene was so important, because it was so welcoming as a forum for all voices. It was, and that was really super important. It was like an equal playing field. For just it's particularly for voices that were marginalized by the standards of societal prejudice. So.
Yeah. I will ask this. You touched on this a little bit, but I know since I'm not a musician myself, I always fail to ask these questions, which I think, particularly in your case, many people would want to hear. So happily, this person has delivered this. When you first pick up a guitar, what do you do? Do you look for a familiar chord? Do you strum all the strings in an open position? What sound are you listening for?
Yeah, I mean, Usually when I pick up a guitar, I try to think that it's basically a tool for expressive sound, and I really get into thinking about what can I do where I can totally remove myself from what's typically heard from this instrument. And so I'll just sort of touch it, and I'll just like create like little sounds off of it, and thinking about like how can this sort of be employed into a song idea where it has like it could be evaluated as a quote unquote song. And that's really, to me, is exciting and fun and challenging. I don't really generally sit down and try to play out of the gate like some kind of melodic concept, whether it be with the chording or single note play. There's certain chords that I kind of sort of fingerings that I have that are very. I have a bit of my own sort of vocabulary with in this tuning. I usually use a tuning these days. It's like C, G, D, G, C, D, which is kind of a bit of an open tuning with a droning C at the top, and I just play around with it. So, but to me, it's all about actually picking it up and plugging it in and doing it, because I feel like I'm preternaturally kind of lazy. I'd rather do the New York Times crossword puzzle before I do anything. Like I just got to finish this, then I'll do that. And sometimes I think like, well, that's okay. I think in some ways, we have such sort of like brief lives, that it's like it's okay to sort of be in a place where you have the privilege of not being not stressed out with having to do something.
Absolutely.
And if you can find that space, it's really precious. And so if I find that, I actually have access to that space. And it's such a privileged place to be, because I know that it doesn't exist for so many people, that I can maybe like not have to sort of entertain the notion of feeding what that creative impulse is, or what its intention could be. It's like, in a lot of ways, when you're writing or playing music, it's with this idea of exchange, and it's with this idea of seeking some kind of acceptance for what you're doing. And so to do it without that being part of it, like not doing it with that means, the ends to that means, where it's like that you're going to have any kind of response from anybody else except for your own edification.
Well, there's a kind of ideal aspect, it seems to me. I mean, look, you have your struggles like everyone, I'm sure, but there's kind of an ideal aspect to your creative life, it seems to me, in that you find levels for everything that you do. I mean, some things are big, some things are small, some things, are for this audience, some things are for that audience, some things are, you just create out of, you let the impulse create the shape and the place, rather than I've got to do this thing. It seems to me like you have remained in a kind of zone of creative freedom, really.
Yeah, I mean, more or less. I get asked to do jobs, once in a while. Like, can you write a song for this? Like, I just got asked to write a song for some punk band in a French film. I was like, oh yeah, I can do that. It's like, but it's not something I would normally do.
Yeah, right.
It's like, but it's a bit of a gig, and so you kind of get paid to do it, and I don't really get that many offers to do such things, and so I'm kind of like, when opportunity knocks, I sort of came up where it's like you answer the door. It's like I mean, Sonic Youth is a band that has somewhat of a high profile, but within a certain, part of the demographic. I mean, it's like we never had a gold record. We never sold millions of records. So none of us are exactly like, we're not like wealthy rock stars or anything like that. We continue to work. We have catalog that's always there's always a little bit of revenue, but nobody's swimming in it. Let's put it that way. And so, we all have our rents and mortgages and mouths to feed and this and that. So there's always I don't think any of us rest on our laurels of in that respect. That said, I don't care, and I actually really like to work. I think when I'm not working and I am just doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, I feel really sort of self-conscious and guilty. Like I should be out there, like
doing your job.
Doing my job, or at least doing something. Like I should be working with Greta Thunberg, and like, which I'm serious. It's like I feel like, why am I not doing that? Why am I sitting here doing the New York Times crossword puzzle?
Well, we'll have one more question. As I mentioned, Thurston will be signing books, and please, I can highly recommend it. And as you can hear, from this evening, Thurston is filled with ideas, and a lot of them are in that book. It's so much more than a band bio that I just highly recommend it. But this sort of struck me as kind of interesting. And as a kind of last question, who from your time in the scene doesn't get enough credit?
Doesn't get enough credit?
Does not get enough credit. Like, I guess, bands you've seen, or, other artists, or,
I was talking, I was on a radio show that's primarily about New York hardcore. And because I was really, I got really into what was going on in the early 80s hardcore scene. And a lot of it had to do with just because it was really such an expressive community of young people. I didn't have that when I was 16. There was not that place to go where you could like join other teenagers to just sort of have this incredible time where you would have this exchange with the band where you were just like, stage diving and slam dancing and circle pit dancing and what have you, and just like pig piling on top of each other and singing along to the Minor Threat and the Bad Brains and Black Flag. And I was already a little bit older than that scene when it started happening in the early 80s, but not by that much. I was caught between the art rocker people that I was already involved with and these younger kind of hardcore punk kids. And so I would just sort of like go to these shows and place myself against the wall as all this activity was happening. And it was such a theater of just this beautiful chaos. And it was just like, it was such an alternative to being like, a typical teenager with a Budweiser, in the Mustang roaring around Main Street, but you were at the hardcore gig. And there was, to me, it was like what gave it such value was that there were so many good songs. So even if I wasn't present there and witnessing that, I just thought there was such good songwriting. When I would hear, like when Minor Threat released "In My Eyes," that second 7-inch, and hearing that, it's such an incredible song of just wearing your emotions on your sleeve. And it's really, and it's minimal and it's primal and it's just like, it's so immediate and so of its time that I think about that time because there were so many young people making music then that I just like curious whatever happened to them because some of them were brilliant, and so you talk about like who never got credit. I would say there was a downtown New York City hardcore band called the Psychos. and they were like the most like wild of those bands. And it was like, I think the singer, I don't think he's alive anymore, named Billy Psycho. And I remember seeing a band like that, and it was just like they were just like, the thing is, they were just so infused with that kind of glory, you know, and they were just alive with it, and they were living for that moment as teenagers and living this life, and then sharing it with this community that was like, it was almost like a shaker convention of like, you know, it was. I mean, the artist that I was really associated with, the band was associated with, was the artist Dan Graham, who's no longer with us. But I would take him to these shows, and he actually videotaped some great moments on his shaky video camera, and he did a book called Rock My Religion, where he equated a lot of what was going on in the hardcore scene with like the shaker rituals and stuff like that. So, answer your question? Yeah, the Psychos.
Very good. Well,
whatever happened to them?
Thurston, thank you so much, man. This was really great. Really a pleasure.